each time when we live a very strong, a very powerful emotional experience, being either positive or negative, it creates a very strong imprint in our soul. And although we are not conscious of it, of course, this emotional experience almost always gives birth to an inner equation, a cause and effect mechanism in our emotional being. Coming back to being Pyotr Ilyich and to the feeling of abandonment of which we are speaking now, the context was the following. So I was around 10 years old, and my family decided to make me study at the Imperial School of Jurisprudence, which was settled in St. Petersburg, and which was unfortunately far away from home, from the town where I lived together with my family. Of course, that for such a sensitive and fragile being as I was, a being who lived all the time up to this age of 10 years with his family, it was a really traumatic event. When I approached under trance in past life regression, this moment I felt an almost cold and physical presence nearby. It was this feeling of abandonment which completely blocked me emotionally. I felt like an inner paralysis. I couldn't think or feel anymore anything, and I lived, I think, for a few months with this feeling of chronic fear, which I couldn't surpass, and which was very difficult for me to surpass. And what I want to stress is that this feeling of abandonment, unfortunately, is something which characterizes almost any human being at least once in a lifetime. And I want to analyze this state of mind a bit for the people who hear us to really understand this phenomena, because what happens when you feel a feeling of abandonment is, firstly, you feel a fear of solitude, but then this feeling of solitude is so tightly intertwined with another feeling, which is the fear of change, a panic of change, I should name it, or the panic of the unknown. There were a lot of studies which were carried during the last years, and in which was shown that this fear of change, this fear of the unknown, gives birth to the stress that we all feel during our current life, and which unfortunately characterizes this present society in which we live. So sometimes studies showed that if you have, for example, a person who waits for the result of a medical analysis and who is afraid of having severe illness like cancer, for example, sometimes the period of waiting of about 2 or 3 weeks might be even more harmful for the human being than the result itself, even if the news might be a negative one. Of course that after you find out a bad news, you might enter a state of depression or an emotional shock, but after a few days, slowly you might start to act, to take some decisions, to do some further steps in order to heal or to change that situation in which you are in. But the period of waiting, so this feeling of uncertainty and the fear of the unknown proved to be the most harmful ever state of mind for the soul health and for the human being balance. And coming back to my book, to being Pyotr Ilyich, what unfortunately happened is that to this terrible feeling of abandonment, which I felt around 10 years, another negative feeling added, which made me create an even more tragic, let's say, inner equation. Because later, at about 14 years old, while I was away in St. Petersburg studying at the School of Jurisprudence, my mother unfortunately died. And this immense trauma for my soul was also linked to this idea of separation, because I told myself, and if I had been home, if I had been besides her, would it have happened the same way? Would it have been possible to change something in this terrible ending? So, in my adult life as Tchaikovsky, each time when I had to leave home, or when I left my brothers or my sister, because each of us lived in a completely separate town or city, and each time I spent a holiday at them and I had to leave them, I felt again and again this trauma, this chronic illness of separation, or this chronic illness of homesickness. Even if I left abroad in order to have a tour, so there were pleasant contexts in which I had success, and I loved to travel, and I loved a lot of places in Europe where I returned times and times again, and I was an extensive traveler for the 19th century. Although the context was frequently a happy one, I was all the time living this chronic disease of homesickness, this anxiety of leaving home, of leaving the dear ones, and all the time I was afraid that if I left home, something bad might happen. I might feel extremely lonely, or something bad might happen with the loved ones at home. So I was keeping on repeating and repeating times and times again the same inner equation in a similar context, of course. And what is more and more fascinating is that I carried this inner equation in my current life, in my present life, because when I was a child, at about 5 or 6 years old, my parents decided to make me go to the kindergarten, and at that moment I was surpassed and blocked by the same cold feeling of abandonment. I was terribly afraid of going to the kindergarten, and that years proved to be very traumatic for me. And later, when I was a teenager, when I confessed to my mother that I was afraid that she would leave me there, she was very amused, and she asked me, "But how could you imagine that I would let you spend your night at the kindergarten?" I was, of course, to some extent amused too, but years later, when I started my past life regression therapy, I acknowledged that it was not something which existed in my head without any reason. It was an actual memory. But what I remembered was from the unconscious mind, and it was from my past life as Pyotr Ilyich. And I was afraid that starting to go together with other children in a system of education would be followed by a separation from my family and a terrible feeling of solitude. So, all in all, we keep on repeating the same inner equation, the same cause and effect emotional pattern. And it is important for us to acknowledge that we have a certain phobia, a certain fear, a certain kind of emotional blockage. And then, after becoming aware of it, we must choose the proper therapy. It might be past life regression therapy or another therapy, of course, with which we resonate. And we must go to the original moment, to let's call it the zero moment, when the trauma was born. And this moment might be in the current life or in another past life. But no fear or phobia is irrational. We might tend to call it irrational only because we do not remember in our conscious mind its real cause. So we must search deeply for its cause in order to heal it and to interrupt this inner emotional equation. I want to tell you something more about this feeling of abandonment. In our lives, we encounter this state of mind when we feel abandoned by a husband, by a fiancé, by a close friend, by a daughter or a son, by our parents, and so on. But what I discovered on an even deeper level of understanding while working through regression therapy is that this feeling of abandonment is probably the deepest and the strongest fear we all have as humans. Because once, in times we do not remember consciously anymore, in what we might call life between lives, the afterlife, or in the world beyond, we were once separated from the divine, extracted from our Father, and we started our process of learning, our process of evolution. We started to develop it as individuals, and this was our first strong trauma as humans. So it's normal that this feeling of abandonment creates a very strong emotional impact on each human being. And I want to close this topic by also telling you that during the last years, important studies were carried out by important institutions, for example, the University of Harvard, and they studied how much of our decisions, thoughts, or perception are guided by our conscious mind or by the subconscious mind. And the results were completely stunning because the results showed that 90 to 95% of our analytical activity, thoughts, decisions, perceptions, and so on, are determined by our subconscious mind. And only 5% of it is determined by the conscious mind. So everything that was ever recorded by our soul in this previous life or in other past lives or in the period spent between lives up in heaven, in the world beyond, determines our reactions being either positive or negative in a certain situation. Everything that we do feel in life, everything that we adore or hate, everything that which is not neutral to us, everything has an already marked emotional imprint in our soul. It might be a color, a place, a person. Each time when we love a color and we adore it, and we might do not know why, when we hate a certain food, when we adore a certain smell, when we meet somebody new and we hate him and we do not know why, or we reach a certain place during a holiday, a summer holiday, and we do not feel at all at ease in that place, although nothing bad happened. Each time there is something behind, an inner equation, a cause and effect relation that was created before. And closing this topic, I would like to read something from my book, hoping that I managed to express it clearly here. So, when our spirit goes through a certain experience, unintentionally it creates an inner equation, a cause and effect relation, a kind of conclusion that it repeats unconsciously, endlessly, until it manages to break an already created pattern. So these emotional equations issued from the traumas we have ever experienced in any life and in any body explain the various fears and phobias we have. Often they seem irrational without finding a logical explanation. When the veil of oblivion was laid, we no longer remember the original cause that makes us feel or act in a specific way. However, our soul patterns also bring us the pleasant experiences in life. In fact, anything that gives us a very strong impression, positive or negative, regarding a person, an object, a place, or a type of situation, is in fact something that is not foreign to our spirit. Everything we adore or hate has behind it most often an experience that we have already encountered before, as a child, or even in another body, in another time, and in another space.